whenever India discusses delimitation, most of us and most of the people think that this is only a political debate. But actually, this is about the Indian judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, has been explaining delimitation for decades now. The court has repeatedly tried to answer some of the very deep constitutional questions, like what exactly delimitation means, why does population matters a lot, or rather, can courts interfere in delimitation matters or not, or is delimitation only a mathematics, what happens when democracy and federalism collide or collapse, and most importantly, how should India become a balanced equality of citizens with equality among the states as well. And to understand this properly, we need to see what the courts themselves have said over a period of time, and we will do this in a very simple format. First, the exact words of the court. We will try to understand what the courts have verbatimly said and told about. Then we will move with what the court actually meant in simple language, and then examples that an ordinary person can understand the constitutional logic. So first thing first, and before understanding the cases, first understand the constitutional structure. So Article 81 broadly says that Lok Sabha representation should broadly follow the population control. A population constituency should have a roughly equal population. That is the second criteria. The democratic idea behind both these two structures is that one person, one vote, and one value. And Article 82 says, after every census, when the formula for 81 will be completed, after every census, seats and constituencies may be readjusted through a law made by the parliament. So technically, Article 81 gives the democratic principle, and Article 82 gives the mechanism for that principle. Now, let us see how the courts have interpreted this. So, starting with the first case, that was of Meghraj Kothari versus Delimitation Commission. It is the case of 1965, where, and this is one of the foundational cases on delimitation, where the Supreme Court had to decide whether and what can courts repeatedly interfere in the delimitation exercises or not. And the court observed, and I quote, Article 82, however, merely envisages that upon the completion of each census, the allocation of seats in the House of the People and the division of each state into their territorial constituencies may have to be readjusted. And the court further said, if the orders made under subsection 8 and 9 were not to be treated as final, the result would be that any voter, if he so wished, could hold up an election indefinitely by questioning the delimitation of the constituencies from court to court. What did this actually mean? This means, and this is what the court was actually trying to convince, that democracy cannot function if elections never happen. So imagine this, suppose every constituency boundary could be challenged endlessly. There is no limit to that. Then before every election, what will happen? That someone will file a case, then another appeal, then another challenge, then another stay order. What would be the result of all these procedures? That India may never finish the elections. So the court said, at some point, delimitation must attain its finality, and this was the judiciary protecting the stability of the democracy by not interfering with the elections altogether. So imagine, and I like to make you explain what it is trying to say. That imagine a cricket tournament. Before every match, teams keep arguing about बाउंड्री लाइन गलत है, पिच प्लेसमेंट अनफेयर हो चुका है, अंपायर पोजीशन चेंज कर ले अपना, वो बीच में नहीं खड़ा हो सकता, उसको कहीं और खड़ा होना पड़ेगा. एंड इफ आर्ग्यूमेंट्स नेवर एंड, देन द टूर्नामेंट इटसेल्फ नेवर स्टार्ट्स. इट विल नेवर गेट स्टार्टेड एट द फर्स्ट प्लेस. सो द सुप्रीम कोर्ट बेसिकली सेड इलेक्शंस आर टू इंपॉर्टेंट टू बी एंडलेसली delayed, and that is why courts generally show restraint in delimitation matters, that without any proper reasoning we will not interfere with matter of delimitation. But the bigger constitutional principle says in this case that this case established something very, very important. Meghraj case said that delimitation is not ordinary administration. It is part of the constitutional machinery of representative democracy. And that is why if you see Article 329, it also limits the judicial interference in the electoral matters. The court was saying that perfect litigation cannot become more important than functioning democracy. You cannot stop the election procedure just for a perfect litigation to happen. Second part of this video is that population and equal representation. So the judiciary has repeatedly emphasized that population-based representation is central to the democratic equality. The constitutional idea is very simple. So if one MP represents 25 lakh people and another MP represents 10 lakh people, then the value of vote becomes unequal. And that is why Article 81 pushes towards the population proportionality. But this is where India's federal problem begins. Because if you see, after population control policies, some states stabilized the population while others continued with their rapid growth. So a constitutional tension was destined to be emerged at this point of juncture. First, that democracy demands equal population representation. Secondly, if any kind of federalism we want, so federal fairness demands that states should not be punished for any policy that is tilted or in line with the population control. So, and definitely this tension is exactly what later constitutional amendments try to balance. The third part of this video is that the freeze on the delimitation. So technically, Parliament later froze the delimitation through the constitutional amendments. What was the reason? The reason was very simple, because the Union recognized something very, very important, that if representation follows only population growth, states that successfully control the population may lose eventually their political influence. So the freeze was not accidental to them. It was technically a conscious constitutional compromise. And the legislative intent was that to encourage the population control, to preserve the federal balance, or to avoid the regional alienation between the people. And this is extremely important to understand, because the constitution was trying to balance all the three, that is democracy, governance incentives, and federal stability. And the part 4, what the judiciary understood about delimitation, and that is very important for in general people to understand, that the courts gradually understood the delimitation not merely as a mathematics or not merely as arithmetic to control the population, but as a constitutional balancing exercise. Because India is never and not only a democracy, it is also a federation. And sometimes those two ideas pull in different directions. So the democratic side says, and that theory says, that more people should mean more representation. And of course, this sounds fair. But if a state has a larger population, then naturally it should have more MPs, right? So otherwise, citizens may not have equal voting power. And that definitely reflects the spirit of Article 81. But the federal side says, and rightly so, that the states are not merely a population containers. Suppose one state invested heavily in any kind of literacy. Secondly, they invested in women's education. Thirdly, they invested in healthcare. And fourth, they invested in family planning. And another state's population expanded rapidly. Then if population power shift only towards the larger population, the first state feels always punished for the governance success that they did over a period of time. And the judiciary and the parliament both recognize the constitutional sensitivity of such a problem. Now, why courts usually avoid the political redistribution questions? Because the judiciary has traditionally been cautious in delimitation matters because of these issues involved. First, that is federal imbalance. Secondly, political representation. Thirdly, parliamentary structure. And fourth, democratic legitimacy. And these are extremely sensitive constitutional questions because if you see, courts therefore usually say that delimitation is primarily a constitutional and legislative exercise, meaning thereby Parliament decides the framework, delimitation commission implements it, and courts intervene only very narrowly or to stop the process in one or the other way. So for an example, to understand this, imagine India as a large housing society. Now suppose your flats in one wing increase rapidly in numbers. Now the society now has to decide that should committee seats depend only on the population or should the old wings also retain the influence in the society. And this is not merely a technical question that we might face. It affects the trust, power, cooperation, and of course the unity inside the society. And that is why courts act very carefully, because one wrong intervention can create a regional distrust in the people a lot. The last part, this part 6, that the judiciary's larger constitutional understanding. So if we look at the judiciary's approach from the beginning till now, a broader constitutional understanding emerges. That the court seems to recognize three things. First, democracy requires population equality. So the court understood that the representation cannot permanently be ignored by the population. Otherwise, democratic equality eventually will weaken. Second, the elections require stability. So the court also says that any kind of endless litigation cannot paralyze the election process altogether. And that is why delimitation decisions attain the finality eventually. Thirdly, India is also a federation. So the constitutional structure of India is not purely majoritarian. Regional balance matters a lot. That is why we see a lot of debate happening when the current government talks about one party, one election, one president, one election, one party kind of rule. Because in our country, federal trust matters a lot, and Parliament may legitimately consider these concerns while structuring the delimitation process. So, what conclusions can ordinary citizens like us take away from the court's understanding? That the biggest lesson from the judiciary's understanding is this, that the delimitation is not only about the numbers that we think. It is about balancing democracy, federalism, governance of how these will work, and of course representation and national unity. So, but never treated delimitation as merely drawing a line on the map. They see it as a part of the constitutional architecture of India itself. So if we combine Article 81 and 82 with the court's understanding, then the constitution becomes much more clearer. Because the constitution wants fair representation, equal vote value, and the stable election, and the federal harmony as well. But sometimes these goals will collide. And perhaps that is the real genius of constitutional law, that the constitution is not merely solving arithmetic problems, it is trying to hold together a civilization-sized democracy in one good. And that is why delimitation remains one of India's most sensitive constitutional issues, and India will face even after 2026, because ultimately the question is not only that how many seats should a state get. The deeper question is, how should India distribute the political power without damaging the democratic equality or federal trust in people? And that is the constitutional challenge the judiciary has been quietly trying to explain for decades.